Let's go ahead and do the meeting beginning ritual, everyone. 起立，面向佛堂，参加三鞠躬，一鞠躬，再鞠躬，三鞠躬，参加各位点传师一鞠躬，开班一鞠躬，请坐下。Please be seated.
Good morning or afternoon or evening to everyone who's joined us here today, whatever time zone you may happen to be in. Here it's 1:30 in the afternoon on a cloudy, overcast, and rainy day. We've actually had a couple of days of pretty strong storms here in Indianapolis. Not unusual for this time of year. But just like every week, it's a wonderful day to be alive and a wonderful day to be involved in this process. Today, I actually want to talk a bit about this process in terms of keeping the rituals and doing the practices described in the teachings. It's a topic that I speak around a lot because I think an understanding of why we do what we do is important in terms of learning to do what we do. Pardon. And quite frankly, in the Iwandaosan organization, there are virtually no constraints on the laity, those folks who are members of the organization, in terms of what they do, how they do it, when they do it, or anything else. And so, as a result, both of the somewhat more rigorous lifestyle that people who desire to be Jiansu and the ordained masters embrace, and the near virtual lack of constraints for the membership, there's a lot of room for misperception and confusion. When one adds to that the amount of mis and disinformation available online, it is very easy to miss the point of the teachings and the practices, and that's something that I try to combat at every turn, so that folks understand what's really going on here, so that they can get past the smoke screen down to the real value proposition of what we do. It is a somewhat unfortunate reality of the great distance between the Western and Asian cultures and languages and world and life views, that we don't really understand the Tao practices in this country simply on their face. It is a traditional Western view of life that particularly as one becomes an adult and starts working at a career of some description, and hopefully, moving their way up through society, as it were, that everything is a battle, that everything's a competition. That there's this need to compete and contend with others in order to make progress. That our activities, by and large, are attached to our desires, and because of that attachment, those activities create agendas that don't need to exist. In other words, in the West, a lot of the reasons we do what we do are to achieve some status symbol of our existence. The new Corvette, the bigger house, the nicer house, the swimming pool, take your pick. Very often it's all about the stuff. And in order to support the behaviors that support the attachments, the desires, and the agendas, very oftentimes we find ourselves rationalizing less than honorable behavior so that we can promote our own self-serving goals. That kind of makes contention a way of life. and that runs directly counter to the Tao teachings. It's one of the quickest ways to wind up in a whole mess of calamities or disasters. Choose your word. Either way, it's the source of an awful lot of problems. It is our attachments and desires that bring us grief in life, that bring us suffering. That's not a supposition. That's 100% a fact. That doesn't mean that all attachments and desires are bad or to be eliminated. As I've said before, I am extremely attached to my family, my wife and children. I'm very attached to the students that I teach and the people that I'm friends with. But I also understand the reality of the attachment, and that is that one day those attachments that I allow myself to keep are going to bring one of us suffering. At some point in time, probably for me much sooner than my wife, and very much hopefully before my children, one of us is going to die. And as a result of that, one of us is going to suffer. That is the natural outcome of attachments between people and from people to things, okay? When we add contention, competition, and self-serving ego self to the attachments and the desires, then the suffering can become, well, difficult to deal with. Then there's the view from outside the temple. And there's very little that we can do to help this particular situation, because it is by definition the view from outside the temple. But people looking in from the outside see the rituals and the practices and the other things that we do as part of the Tao disciplines as more or less constraints on behavior and thought. And nothing could be further from the truth. But without an adequate understanding of the practices and teachings, drawing a different conclusion from someone who doesn't understand that is remarkably difficult. I am not constrained in my life in any way by being Kanzu. But what I will say is that my life from the inside out has been greatly transformed in a process that is still continuing to this day. I don't find that to be a burden. It certainly isn't hard work. I don't put tons and tons of effort into it. It's something that simply happens because I choose to follow this path. Try explaining that to someone who's never seen or understood the path. And so for one, once again, looking in from the outside, they will naturally, because the human brain is a pattern matching machine, attempt to make an association between what they see as their attachments, desires, their own life practices, if you will, to make sense of why we do what we do. That is, what do we get out of the practices? What desire are we fulfilling? What attachment are we feeding? What part of the ego self are we understanding better or furthering its goals by performing these practices? When we live in a world where contention and competition are the ways to progress, and desires and attachments to things are what motivate the efforts, it is extremely difficult to understand the process of loss. Okay? However, in reality, when one starts to walk down this path, particularly as one gets more deeply into the teachings, when one goes from being a rote novice to an intermediate practitioner or a more advanced practitioner, and I'll get there one of these days, they find, and I've found, that the rituals and practices liberate the mind and the spirit. Instead of imposing constraints and limits on what a person can do or should do, we are relieved of those rules and constraints in favor of returning to the natural state. It's a state that Lao Tzu speaks of often in the Tao Te Ching. Sometimes directly, in concentrating the energy and achieving relaxation, can one be like an infant. An infant doesn't understand the ego self or any kind of a personal agenda or attachment. And yet every infant is a child of the Tao itself, perfect in every way, connected in ways that we can't even begin to imagine, to a void that we're hoping to return to one day. And so the more deeply that we understand the teachings, the more deeply that we delve into the practices, the more mental and spiritual freedom we attain as we get closer to becoming the natural person. Now, becoming the natural person doesn't mean that we do whatever in the world we want to do. There are still things like right and wrong and good and evil. Those things exist. Okay? The teachings of the Tao do not remove good and evil or right and wrong from the equations of life. However, they give the individual complete power to choose what direction that individual will take in their lives. And if they decide that they want their lives to run completely opposite to the flow of the Tao, then they can swim that way until they wear out. For a person whose heart's desire is only evil, the Tao of heaven doesn't correct or change their course. It simply allows them to paddle on. It is much easier to learn to move in congruence with that current, to move in alignment with the Tao itself. And those who do naturally rise to the surface and don't have to work to paddle because they're carried along by that flow. Because of that, the fears and the attachments that we carry with us most of our lives give way to a much brighter present moment awareness. We spend our days second by second immersed in each and every one of them. I got to tell you, it's one of the coolest things that I've derived from walking this path. It is kind of the ability to squeeze every ounce of life out of every second that I have. Okay? Even death itself no longer is an object of fear or anxiety. It becomes a natural part of living. Now, I don't relish the thought of my own demise, and I'll be very sad if another one of my children goes before I do. But it doesn't change my understanding. And the understanding removes the anxieties and the fears. Kind of works that way for a lot of things in life. And it's worth having. Okay? To get down to the value proposition, one has to put in the time and the discipline to understand the teachings. Not just intellectually in the mind, but in the heart, in the spirit, where our emotions are forged, where our reactions to life as we live it are born, where our choices are made. And by practice and making mistakes and falling down, and then getting back up and correcting them. I very often use the analogy of walking down a forest path as what my path looks like, and running into every rock, tree, fallen log, and mud hole that one can find along that path to learn how to avoid them in the future. For anyone who thinks that I'm some kind of special when it comes to learning these teachings or walking this path, I'm here to tell you I'm not special, I'm just determined. See, we're not called to be perfect. We're called to be willing. And that's all anyone has to be. By being willing to walk the path, by definition, you assume the willingness to fall over every rock, fallen log, twig, branch, and into every tree there is, and to get back up and keep going. By doing that a few times, you learn to submit the ego to humility and compassion. By falling down on your own, you understand why other people fall down. Now they stop being the enemy and start becoming another soul on the path trying to find their way home. Okay? And certainly by living one day at a time. We only get 24 hours at a whack because it's all we can handle. When we decide to agonize about the future or agonize about the past, we're not living, we're worrying. And we can't really change either one. All we can do is make our decisions in the here and now and hope that those decisions are right and appropriate. And if we find out we made a mistake, then the next time we make a different choice. Okay? It's not our life circumstances that dictate what and who we're going to become in life. It's our choices. Okay? We always have the ability to change our own path. In our lives, we are the sovereign, we are the emperor, we are the person who can make the decision. We are not the victims of fate or destiny or some kind of cruel universal joke unless we play that joke on ourselves. Nobody can take power over another person that they don't give them. That's an important thing to know, and it is absolutely liberating to know that. We got to realize that from the outside, okay, looking into the temple, it's extremely difficult to understand a different set of answers. It's difficult to understand or to grasp why we do what we do and how we do it and how come it works. It's not like buying a new Corvette. There's not a shiny new red thing in the driveway you can look at and say, well, that worked. And yet, what one achieves by following the teachings is worth more than any car you can buy. I don't care how expensive it is. Everything we acquire in this life in the way of stuff is transient. One day it's going to fall into the earth that it came from, and there is nothing we can do to stop that. But what we gain by following this path brings about the evolution of the true self, and that does not die. I believe that with all of my heart. It's for that reason that we can't really communicate the why or the how in words. I've been trying to do that for, over 10 years now? All I can do is kind of explain the process. It's the example that we set that hopefully other people will want to follow. But they themselves have to discover their own path. No one else can walk my path and I can't walk theirs. But for a while, maybe we can walk down the same path kind of together. Okay? And it's that process of becoming a natural person. And it is a process. It's not instant enlightenment most of the time. Heaven knows if it happened to me, I'd be very happy that it did. But so far in my life, I have not yet been fortunate enough to have been dinged with the scepter of instantaneous enlightenment. And so we keep going through the process. And it's a process of loss, of giving up what we don't need in favor of what works, of uncluttering the life and the home and the heart. It's not one of the accumulation of stuff or the adherence to rules and protocol. It's the process of becoming our highest and best selves. And that's what's important. And that's why we do what we do. So in the coming couple of weeks, when we talk through the mechanics of the rituals and the conduct of the rituals and the equipment of the rituals. Now you all understand, another piece of that foundation, that is why we do what we do. Okay. I also, in this particular case, welcome any and all email questions as we get ready to go further into that particular set of topics. Thank you all very much for letting me share with you. And I promise you, Derek has a fascinating lecture for us all today. Thanks much.
Let's go ahead and do the meeting closing ritual. 起立，面向佛堂，持架深鞠躬，一鞠躬，再鞠躬，三鞠躬，持架各位点传世一鞠躬，结班一鞠躬。Okay, guys, we are done.